Good evening, everyone here and those who are attending online. Unfortunately, it's already the fourth and last talk by Bette Talvacchia of the series that began last week. Common Ground, Explorations of Contemporary Modern Art Through a Renaissance Lens. Betty, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Hello, everyone here in front of me, and to all of the people online in whatever time zone you're in, whatever time of the day. And let me just once again thank you all for being in this room, and for those of you who are online, and a special thanks tonight for those of you who have taken the time to follow all of the talks. I appreciate it very, very much, and look forward to any kind of input that you would like to give me. So as I start tonight, let me just remind you that what we've done is in some ways kind of worked up to the accumulation of this material, starting with incorporation of images that I looked at as really quotations inside of a conversation that artists were having with those who came before them. And we've seen them looking to their artistic heritage, to their personal heritage, and often combining elements from those different legacies that they have. And we came to looking at material culture, really, where we saw the same materials being used to make the objects throughout time, and new approaches that then could turn those materials into something very new. And then came to the variation where we could identify a very specific work of art from the past that the artist used for, again, a conversation, sometimes amplifying what was said, sometimes twisting it around, sometimes talking back to the work. But at any rate, we could see that there was an engagement of a specific work. So what I want to do now is really push that category a bit further. When I talk about transformation, sometimes there will be instances where the original source has been changed to such an extent that it takes a while to understand it's there. And often it's the artists themselves that tell us through a title or through something in the image, pay attention, because I want you to think about this other work along with the one I'm presenting you. Sometimes I'm going to look at these broader themes that have meant a lot to different cultures in different times and get used over and over again. And so there might not be just one source, but it's a thematic connection. And there are a few cases where I had an immediate reaction to what I saw, and I'm still trying to nail down, if I can, what specific might be behind that. And since I've had such a nice time talking with all of you about it, I'm going to share a couple of those with you. And that will be that until a little coda at the end that I hope will have particular meaning for this particular institute. So let me start now. Make sure I can do this correctly. Yes, that probably I could have had behind me as I was saying all of that to you. Transformation. And I'm going to start with something that I haven't really done before, which is to show you at the very start of the 20th century, because of course my parameters have been 20th century into our own day, with an academic style of painting. And just to say a word that of course that was going on as well. And here you can see absolutely the model for Theobald Chartrand's James Hazen Hyde, looking to Agnolo Bronzino for a wonderful way of posing that young man. And at first I thought, oh, great. Chartrand was a very sought after portraitist in Belle Epoque, New York, coming, of course, from France, where he had his training and his major career, but then became very popular. And I thought, he was, looking around at the Met, because that's where Bronzino's young man lives, until I as a good researcher, said, yes, when did the Met acquire that? And it wasn't until 1929. So then you say, and it came from the Havemeyer collection. So what I want to do now is track down, did Mr. Hyde know the Havemeyers, which I have a very strong suspicion in the upper echelons of New York society at that time. Both Hyde and Mr. and Mrs. Havemeyer were Francophiles and bought a lot of French art. And even though we have a Bronzino here, my suspicion is that Hyde saw it in perhaps an acquaintance or a friend's collection or heard about it through someone. And my suspicion is that the subject, the sitter himself, might have asked for that pose. And I say that because this is the only instance, at least I'm aware of, in which the artist views such a specific Renaissance model. So of course, never say never, because the next image I look at could have it. But up to this point, let's just say, to my knowledge, it was not a common practice in his oeuvre. So I like the idea of James Hyde, who was quite a character. I mean, there's a whole story to tell about him, but he inherited a very important company from his father. He was like a multi-millionaire in a moment when that really meant tons of money. At any rate, he was a society fellow. He was a bit of a dandy. And so that pose, I think, suited him very well, whoever made that choice. But look at the differences, that the American dandy is a little more self-conscious, right? He engages the viewer in a more flirting kind of way. It's a little bit of a twisting the head and, yeah, I do look great, and, you know, come on up and say hello. Whereas Bronzino's young man is pretty much, that elbow is saying, keep your distance, and it's not that inviting. He's showing you how terrific he is. So I won't use all the Renaissance terms for that, but you get the idea of how that can be used with, you know, a little bit of a more relaxed attitude in the way the 20th century sitters holding the book and resting his arm around. So specific modifications, but I think an extremely successful variation or transformation. We'll see which one of that particular work of art. So I'll get back to you on that in terms of if that can be nailed down any further. But I wanted to use that as a foil to look at the next portrait by Bisa Butler. And here, she is using a new approach to painting, which is to use just fabric in her making of the entire picture. She proudly defines herself as a quilter, and she makes reference to especially the African American women's community of quilters and that history. And both her mother and her grandmother were great seamstresses, so she learned about sewing from them. So as she developed her own style, this is an artist who was born and raised and worked and still works in New Jersey. So an East Coast artist, but of Ghanaian descent. And remember that we saw Elan Atsui referring to his Ghanaian culture in terms of the particular colors and of the fabrics that they are so well known for. So she puts those heritages together to create her paintings with fabric. And she's so skillful that when you get close and look, there's modeling, gradations by her careful choice of fabrics. And she has said that she will often choose the fabrics to have particular meaning in terms of their patterns, where they come from, and so forth. And then looking further into this, I found out that for this particular portrait of the equestrian, I'll say a few more words about the sort of content of that once I get past this amazing material bit, that she used for this particular work fabrics from Vlisco, which is a company based in the Netherlands since the 19th century, and they produce these amazing fabrics. Their site is really wonderful. and that they have always had a special relationship with West and Central Africa. So the more I looked into this, I thought, well, this was absolutely made to be included. Although here, what I'm showing you is a portrait by Paul Nadar, son of the better known Felix, and from his studio where he posed a woman named Selika Lazevsky, who was, again, in the Belle Epoque. There's another little connection of what we saw before. She was very famous as an equestrian and was an expert in dressage. And there you have her in that the outfit that shows her expertise. And I would say posed very similarly to Pontormo's halberdier. And again, I'm not arguing that Nadar was quoting or talking to Pontormo, but you know, that pose of using the torso to twist and create volume, to vivify the portrait, and then turn the head to face the viewer. That's something that we have seen quite a lot, you know, develop through the Renaissance. So I would say that is a kind of general historical pose that I think Nadar would, at least in visual memory, have recourse to, because I think, and anyone in photography can tell me this, that in the early moments, there was a tendency for formal portraits to pose people in postures that were reminiscent of art that was recognizable. So I'll leave that also up in the air as something for more research. But here again, just wanted to make another point about some of these artists who are working with textiles who are doing such phenomenal things. And this is giving a new life to many traditional elements in art. Plus, she started, in fact, working with photographs of her family, her grandparents. And so she also talks about her desire to give visibility to the history of her own people and by extension to the African diaspora. And notice the colors that she uses for the skin of her subject, of Selika. And she is using multi-hues, different kinds of hues, to caution people to not make quick assumptions about race based strictly on skin color. And this is something that we've seen a few times and we'll see again. Okay. All right, here's another instance where I saw an image that in my mind started trying to get a response, and I realized I was thinking about Rubens' portrait of a woman. Now you see the correct orientation of it on the far right. And I manipulated it, I confess, so I flipped it over, and that's when I saw a very similar pose to the one of Lady Gift of the Foreign Land that Eniwe Oluwaseyi painted. And as I started to look at that, I thought, okay, well, that speaks a lot to me, but let me look into this painting, and maybe I'm just now forcing the argument a little too much. Well, I discovered that this artist, who is Nigerian, exhibited this in the Rijksacademy in 24. He's been in residence there from 23 to 25. And on his site, he says that he is really a self-taught painter. He was studying engineering in the university, but he watched YouTube and he read books and he then taught himself to paint. And he wants to use painting for social commentary. So of course you go back to portrait traditions if that's one of your goals. He says then at this, in the statement that he makes at the Rijksacademy site, that he works from observation and imagination, and then in quotes, combined with myriad visual references to the art historical canon. I said, yes. So perhaps someday I can get in touch with him and get more information about that. But in the meantime, and I should say this is also very important, that that subject is very meaningful because he has painted portraits of members of the albino community in Africa who are a minority community and apparently targeted for not so great treatment. And he has worked with that community and wants to give them visibility in his art. So the social context of his paintings and his portraits is really fundamental. Yes, so obviously a fabulously interesting artist. And as I tried to find more works by him, I came across The Final Curtain. And that I said, okay, because I know, it's meant most of you do, Titian's portrait of Archbishop Filippo Arquinto that is in the Philadelphia Museum of Art. And that painting has its own very interesting history. It's very disturbing, in fact, when you see it. And as you might imagine, Titian's work was painted when this man had received his position in Milan, but for political reasons, he was prevented from taking up his appointment as Archbishop in 1556 from political reasons. And the veil obscuring him is telling you that. But his right hand that has been placed on the armrest, to pull it a little further out and show you where he's wearing his episcopal ring, is telling you that, you know, he has that. He officially is in that position, but has for the moment been prevented from taking it up. Now, when I see what Oluwaseyi has done, it's very interesting because, as I say, I usually try to look for the differences once I notice the similarities, because that's a lot of times where the instructive messages are. The curtain is pulled on the other side, and that young man's face is really emerging from it. He's not practically at all hidden by that curtain. So I see a bit more of an optimistic statement there. And yet that very close quotation of the that particular fabric, and even the form of those folds, telling us to think about Titian's painting, is going to also say a lot. But that young man, you know, he's in an interior that's not so dark and mysterious. We're given a little more upbeat information about him. And as I say, if you look, that just side of his face is covered. So I think we have a more positive story being told there. And I'm going to stick with portraits for a moment because I've been focusing on narrative as one of the great unifiers and the very strong thread in these historical continuities, but the portrait is as well. And here is our friend Audrey Flack. I want to have one more mention of her. You remember that she was the self-identified radical contemporary old mistress. And this is Audrey Flack at an early moment of her career when she's making the change from her training in abstract painting toward figuration. And so you can see in The Lady with the Pink that it's much more of a study of sort of moving that paint around, as the AEs used to say, and seeing what kind of form could be generated with those very expressive brush strokes and passages of paint. But she puts that pink in her hand, and that's a nice hit of color in that composition, but it does already tell us that she's thinking of the portrait tradition from historical times. And I just put together several different examples because, as you know, that pink was often a symbol of betrothal. And while to my knowledge, it's mostly used with young men, we see that also women could hold that. So I like Audrey Flack also giving it, putting it in a woman's hand. And I think it's a subtle touch, but it's an art move as well as, I think, a kind of declaration that, yes, I'm going to embrace the use of the figure. And then remember that she moved her work into what has been called photorealism. So she really pushed that quite a bit from that first moment where she's still very attached to that kind of very expressive use of brushwork. And now, again, I'm going to make you dizzy with the different kinds of images you're seeing, but here's the anchor. Here's another portrait with a modern comparison. And the portrait by Jacopo Pontormo is not only an amazingly sensitive and compelling one to engage, but as we've learned and was spoken about eloquently a few weeks ago here in another conference, that it has what I would call a troubled history, or let's say a troubling history, because this painting was purchased by the Walters Museum in Baltimore. And when they purchased it, there was no figure of that young girl in evidence. That child had been painted over at some point. And when the Walters Museum began to restore it and clean it, because it apparently was not in great shape, they found that there was another figure in that painting, which they then uncovered. And that figure is Giulia de' Medici, which now I say that and you say, oh, right. But when that cleaning first took place in 1937, that figure was identified as Cosimo de' Medici. So poor Giulia was painted out twice. She was erased twice, I would say, once because of race and once because of gender. Because if you look at that little girl closely, you will see that she is a mixed race child. And then you will remember that her father, Alessandro de' Medici, the first Duke of Florence, was himself an African European in the sense that he had mixed parentage, a Medici father and an African mother. And those facts have often been erased from history. And this is what the conference that Dennis Hieronymus put together was trying to address.
Hidden in plain sight.
Hidden in plain sight. And Giulia was hidden not in plain sight until the restorers did their job. So that, is a whole very important history to the painting. And when I then was traveling and I saw an exhibition and I came across this portrait of Deborah Fitzgerald by Aaron Douglas. Wow. Again, my first thing is like, I see there's something in my head. Well, it's the Pontormo. And I thought again, well, maybe now I'm just seeing this everywhere. So I looked at it and thought about it. And first, of course, checked that it is in the 50s, so the Walters painting had already been cleaned. And here's my thesis, that Aaron Douglas, who remember, lived in Europe for a while, did that wonderful still life where the Titian is upset, and he showed us his interest in and respect for old masters and what he learned from them, but also he's going to push that a little bit. And I have a thesis that when he saw Deborah Fitzgerald, he might have been reminded of the little girl in this painting, and perhaps push the resemblance a bit. Of course, strongest point of resemblance is that wonderful Cupid's bow mouth that they both have. And get, is this an artist liberty license, or was that there? But I think that there are several reasons why Aaron Douglas might have been familiar with the Pontormo, and I'm going to get back to you on that if my ideas work out. But look again at the difference, that Deborah is looking at the viewer very clearly, whereas Giulia's eyes are a bit averted. Giulia's very melancholy, and it is soon after her father's death. She's now a ward of the Medici family. That's Maria Salviati, who is taking care of her, and that beautiful movement and touching of the hands is telling you the acceptance and the love of that child, whereas Deborah is very straightforward, looks kind of strong, and she is engaging the world that she's looking at and that's looking at her. Oh, there, I could have put that up, gets you just a little closer to both of them. Okay, now thinking about these portrait-like compositions, that can be very symbolic. Let me take you back to Kerry James Marshall, to his painting Stigma Stigmata. And I think, again, if you give that a moment's close reading, you see all of the different elements that he's bringing together to present to us a group of people who have been tormented, who have suffered, and that we see an analogy to the suffering of Christ. And remember that for me, I'm always thinking about this path of movement, that in the Renaissance, there was that extreme push to idealize naturalism so that sacred figures could be shown as humans. And now we have human beings who are being pushed a little bit into that kind of iconography so that we are shown a treatment of them that gives respect and a spiritual being. And so it's working on the basis of saintly characters, working then backwards to claiming that respect for your subject in the way you paint them. And again, looking closely, yes, you can see very clearly the marks on the face of that figure that do have a visual dialogue with the streams of blood on the face of Christ. There's a cruciform behind the black figure that's been made, and 2 red crosses. I love that because we know what the Red Cross is as a modern group of people doing good, but Christian imagery of the cross is being referred to. And of course, on either side of the main figure, there are women with fair skin and fair hair in a golden radiance. And so you're being shown then a contrast of figures who don't have that stigma or perhaps stigmata, and to think about, let's get this a little bit more equitable. And if we stay with images of the suffering Christ, there is, of course, a very rich tradition of that. And I show you here again, you can see that tonight I'm going a little bit further afield in the kinds of comparisons I'm making, but I'm going to argue the reasons for it. Obviously, what I'm thinking about in this comparison with this street artist whose tag name is Bastardia, wonderful name, who is from Bogota, and to my understanding works between Colombia and Italy. But her true identity is not known, at least I don't know it or couldn't find it, that she remains anonymous, paints under this name, and does exclusively street murals. And the one you see is in Buenos Aires. She takes as her subjects often women's issues, issues of violence, and social concerns. So in this image, looks like painted on a shutter there, we have a child who looks like he's rolling a coil of barbed wire. Right, so why is it now that I'm taking the liberty to make a connection? Well, I think she gives me that possibility by putting a nimbus behind the child, a sun, certainly, but it acts as a halo. The child is not gender specific in the way it's painted, but we could think of a child like Christ. There's nothing that contradicts that reading. The skin is multi-hued, and we see that strategy again. But the fact that the child is moving along with this very dangerous and violent material I think, is, you know, making statements about innocence and violence on the streets and using that very circular motif for the barbed wire. And I think that because there's other iconography that makes a reference to a nimbus, perhaps we can read something, some shared visual language in that particular image. So that, as I say, gets a bit further. You'll notice that in the other talks, I say very disciplined in terms of one-on-one connections. And here are some to meditate upon that may or may not, in the end, be convincing. Still a wonderful image and a wonderful artist to know about. That same image of suffering and focusing just on the face or just on a head, to take it away from the rest of the body and to localize all of the pain, the expression that you want to make, that the artist wants to make about the human condition of suffering. And do we bring that on ourselves? Do others visit it upon us? That is representation of the body on a very, very basic level. And of course, in the Christian tradition, and as expressed in the Renaissance, there was the focus on the face of Christ as the man of sorrows, as the suffering individual, as a vehicle for meditation. And I think that Louise Bourgeois, in her head, she did a group of these when she was quite advanced in age. You know that she was a French artist who then went to the United States in the 1930s and continued working there for a very long career. She made her personal biography a very large part of the art that she made in terms of her own personal symbolism and the stories that she referred to. So when she made these heads out of textiles, even the choices, say in the yellow, pale red one, where you're thinking of excoriating the skin of different layers underneath the skin, I think all of that was very intentional. And again, she gets a lot of emotion and sort of forcing the viewer to think about this basic aspect of the human condition through these small scale heads. And of course, if we're thinking of faces of the suffering Christ in the historical and Christian tradition, then at some moment we have to think about the veil of Veronica. And of course, that comes from a story from the Passion of Christ, when, as he is carrying his cross to be crucified, a woman in the crowd comes forward, takes her veil, and wipes his face to try to show solidarity in his suffering, and then just practically to wipe away all of the blood that was there. And the story is that she was rewarded for this act of piety by Christ miraculously having the imprint of his image remain on the cloth. And she has then become or come to be called Veronica. That is the Vera icona, the true icon, the true image of Christ. And this is a subject that is a very powerful one for devotion, to think of all of those elements from the narrative, but particularly for artists. So remember, as Isabella Ducrot told us to think about the fact that when you're working on canvas or when you're working on linen, you have got a woven piece of fabric. So that is always part of the image that is there as a fact. And here we have not a painting, but a miraculous image, but we're thinking about image making on fabric. So artists have really delighted in the period we're talking about, with artists like Hans Memling or later with Matteo Preti, using illusionism in their work to create that fictive piece of fabric on a real piece of fabric. And from that, we meet up again with, I think, one of the many stars of these talks, Chris O, who takes that thought and he repaints a face from the Netherlandish canon and entitles his work Styx. So I put a face painted on a real piece of fabric beside Christ's face painted on a fictive piece of fabric, but a very convincing one. But look what Chris O does. That's not a face of Christ by any stretch of the imagination. So he's making, I would say, a visual reference to a face on a piece of fabric, but it's a pillowcase. And not only is it a mundane object, but the fact that, as we know, pillowcases have a habit of getting all wrinkled and so forth, and there are movements around during the night and can leave their impressions on our own faces. He very cleverly allows that fact of the material properties to make a disjunction in the face. And there again, that disjunction, human beings, we don't like to see body parts being messed up because it hits home a little too strongly. So he's purposely giving us an image that's a little bit disturbing. That to me looks like the face of Mary from the crucifixion that's in the Philadelphia Museum. I'm not sure about that. It's not quite as close, or at least to my knowledge. Someone here might have much more knowledge of the Netherlandish canon and tell me that. But whoever it is, it's first of all not Christ. It looks female because I think we read the way that face is painted almost like there's a veil across the forehead. But it is pretty androgynous in terms of gender there, and that could be willed. So as I say, these are the questions that I'm still asking. But with Chris O, as with almost all modern and contemporary artists, pay attention to the title when the artist themselves put that title on there. So he called this Sticks. And all of a sudden I said, why are we calling it Sticks, Chris? But I haven't asked him. He is a working artist right now, so I hope someday maybe to ask him personally. At the moment, what I always do, of course, is to make sure that I've got enough in my head about that mythological ancient term. And the Styx, of course, is the river that goes through Hades. It is also the name of a goddess who I guess is represented in that river the way often happens. So she, I'm saying now, must be Styx. And why would that be important? Well, there is a boundary between the underworld and our world. Sleep sometimes is thought of as getting precariously close to that boundary. And that's about what I have at the moment. So this one is a little more mysterious to me, but just as powerful. And again, we see how he gives this mystery to and creates something entirely different through the use of historical art with very unanticipated supports for his work. All right, so cloth, textiles. Let's think about head wraps for a moment. And one of the things that has always attracted me about Pontormo's deposition, which all of us can tomorrow run down and have a look at, such a commanding painting, but I love the abstraction in it, as well as the pathos of all of the figures and the stories they tell us. And the veils that these two women wear in the detail that I'm showing you, they express the turmoil within those figures. And I mean, there's no other reason for them to be painted in such movement and incredible twists and turns. And if you look at the blue one that is right underneath that hand, as though it's pointing it out to us, notice how that fold just comes right down and echoes the gesture of the figure's hands caressing the side of Christ's head. And that fold does the same thing. So here again are moments that I want to point out where the artist from the Renaissance is thinking about, yes, the properties of cloth and how to paint them, but also is thinking very abstractly in terms of form and shapes and what that can do to the viewer's experience. So since I almost always have that image in my mind, when I saw some works by Kyle Meyer several years ago from a series that he calls Interwoven, and I had never seen this artist's work before, but I was captured by these amazing headpieces that the figures wore. And when I looked into what he was doing, it became even more eloquent because Meyer, at his site, he tells the story of having visited an African community, an African country, where where homosexuality was, and as far as I know, still is illegal. And he, a Caucasian artist working in New York, went and established ties with members of the gay community there and bonded through that sameness, through that shared homosexuality, although the group in the community of Swaziland, as it was called when he was there, could not express that aspect of their identity in public. So as he got to be friends with them, he thought of a project where he would, with them, choose pieces of fabric that in that culture would have been seen as feminine, or to be worn by a female. They would choose the fabric that they thought was, just attracted them aesthetically. And the artist then designed a wrap for them to wear, and he photographed them because his main medium is photography. Once he made the photograph, he then cut it into strips, and he also cut the fabric into strips. And then he wove the images you see here, in part because he was learning weaving techniques, as I understand it, in that community, but also because it was a way of both showing and not showing those figures. They're present, but they're also hidden behind that web. They've been fragmented, they've been reassembled in a way that says something very clear about their identity, but does not let you see their facial features, which is the way we usually read identity. So another part of that series is called Unidentified, and I show you a few of those with a detail of one of the works that has been woven with such incredible complexity. Okay, now sticking again with this idea of what these shapes on heads can do, whether they show faces or don't, or express emotions that are interior to the figure. Let me show you some hooded figures from early Renaissance tradition in France. And these, of course, are the Florence, the grieving figures from, I show you two different tombs and give you the information about where they came from, made for the Dukes of Burgundy. In the first instance, Philip the Bold was the one who apparently got the idea for and commissioned this work, which you see took a very long time to be put together. His son, John the Fearless, said, yes, I would like one too. So there's another, and then different members of aristocratic families asked for them. So we have one of Philippe Poe. And these are, I think, astounding in their power exactly because they cover all the faces. And I show you that the comparison of the two different works because that first group, the figures are really statuettes. They're quite small scale, but when you see them photographed independently, they could be 20 feet tall. So I wanted to show you first their actual size, although the, of course, the mourners, the bearers of the resting figure are then life-size in the later version. So what got me thinking about that? Well, a recent exhibition at the Guggenheim called Going Dark had one section where they dealt with the hoodie. And that, as we all know, it's now, I think, an international piece of apparel, but certainly mostly connected to urban culture and particularly African-American culture, sometimes in a very negative way, because sometimes young men who were wearing these hoodies were profiled when culprits were being looked for different kinds of street crime. Then it also becomes a kind of badge, you know, like I'm going to put this hood up and then I kind of dare you to try to give me trouble simply for doing that. Sometimes you wear them because it's raining outside, you know, or because you're chilly or because you've been running. So they're a practical garment. They're of today, but they have taken on a lot of symbolic resonance, both positive and negative, some that different communities have embraced and others that are, you know, a bit shameful. But they have now been taken up as a sculptural form for discourse all the way back in the early 90s by David Hammons. And there on the right, you see that sculpture that is called the hood, which works very nicely in English because, of course, it's just telling you it's a hood. But that is also, you know, urban slang for the neighborhood, you know, see you in the hood. And there we get the double meaning of that garment and what it has come to symbolize in urban culture. And David Hammons was always way ahead of the curve in his understanding of very forceful images made in very simple ways. And more recently, John Edmonds has taken up this idea with his photographs. So the insert there shows you a series of photographs that he called hoods, where he turns the sitter around and you never see faces. And, you know, how are you reading that figure? Is it male? Is it female? Is it none of the above? What color skin does it have? You don't know. And are you making assumptions about that? And it also is a great formal abstract shape in terms of just art making. So all of these things have been taken up. So here I'm going to show you now just some more images in terms of what I saw, because of course the Florence are not involved in that kind of culture, but think of why they were hooded. Now, apparently mourners in this culture were given these long robes, hooded robes to wear, because as you mourn the dead, it's not you in your specific identity. What is important is the act of grieving, the act of praying. It doesn't matter if you're a duke or if you're the most humble person in the culture. That hooded garment is going to obscure your rank and your status and your gender, and that is equivalent. But this was done for purposes of prayer, of grieving, of meditation. So again, I want to think a little bit more about resonance that might have back and forth in time. Certainly when you obscure the human face, it does something very strong to any viewer, because again, that's our basic point of contact with other human beings. All right, so if we take that basic idea, let's see what a very creative artist, Sandra Mujinga, does with now monumental size hooded figures. She is a Norwegian artist who was born in the Republic of Congo, and she is extremely eloquent about her work and her ideas. So you can find interviews with her on YouTube, and she will say many more fabulous things than I could ever hope to. But the experience of seeing these is really quite strong. And that image with the green light, that's not just like in the old days, a bad slide that's turning colors. She specified that, and she's thinking of the techie green screen in film and what happens with that. Because again, this was in the Guggenheim exhibition. The green one is, as you see, their installation with a viewer to give you a sense of scale. Where's the body? This, again, the exhibition talking about visibility and invisibility, particularly of the Black body. But when you have the garments and the body's gone, you know, what's left? And there are many, many channels of meditation that she mentions as she talks about her work. And even though I wasn't able to see the exhibition in Vienna, there you have some, she says, you know, a lot of her figures are really scary, but she said, I cheer for the monsters in this. But they are, you know, something to not take lightly. Their presence is something that really stops you in your tracks. And I put a little detail of the seasonal pulses as opposed to the spectral keepers, right? Wonderful titles. That the interior of the fabric that she's using is a kind of viscous red. So she does give you the sense of a body that has lost its skin, but the inner parts are still there. And for scale, again, I just put that procession of statuettes down there to remind you of what can happen when you monumentalize things, which we usually think of as historical. But here she's monumentalizing those figures to very, very compelling results. Okay, I got to move myself along. Yes, so once more, this also, thank you to the curators of that exhibition of Going Dark, because Rebecca Belmore had this work in there as well. And her sculpture of Mixed Blessing, and you got to think about that title. You see that there are unnaturally white hands that are in a gesture of supplication that you see at the bottom of the figure. I think it's important to know that Belmore is Canadian, but a member of, or say, and a member of the Lac Seul First Nation. So her point of view, she's also a performance artist. She works in mixed media, but her concerns are seeing the world, as she says, through Indigenous eyes. She worries about the impact of humanity with and in nature and thinks about those elements in her art. And she also thinks about, of course, her identity, both as an Indigenous person and as an artist. And if you read the back of that figure, you can just, you see a red thing there. That's the letter N. And in the form of a cross, it says, fucking Indian, fucking artist, excuse the expletives, meant for impact, in the form of a cross, and that's N, is where they both come together. So she is telling you that she has experience, and those two words repeated are the kinds of slurs, the kinds of insults that she has been subjected to for both reasons, in her work of art and in her personal identity. And she is wearing them as a cross and saying, I have no sense of contradiction about those two parts of me. Everyone else deal with it. So that is, you know, a kind of aggressive aspect of this. But then for the rest of it, it's very, very touching, almost tender when you come around in the front and see that figure where once again the face is not there. It's hidden with hair, with something that hair also seems like feathers, and those are two materials that are important to Indigenous communities. And in the center of the cascade of hair, there is a red line, and that of course makes you think of blood. By the placement, you think of tears. So there is mourning involved in this figure, and the obfuscation of the face for symbolic purposes and for universality, I would say also is something akin to elements that we can meditate on in the larger historical tradition. Okay, well, from thoughts of death, I'm going to move you to thoughts of paradise, really. So from those sculptures that are so present and tactile, let me take you as, again, just a big leap to say, okay, let's look at abstraction again. somewhere where we're told, you know, Renaissance elements can't tread. But when it's Cy Twombly, they certainly can, because he tells us that this is Parnassus. He also has made, in the past, of course, made statements that he loved the art of Raphael. And, you know, Cy Twombly had his career in Rome, so all of Renaissance art, or at least a very big swath of it, was there. Excuse me for saying that in Florence. Certainly a lot of Raphael is there. And I think often when we look into Twombly's work and we see his incredible connection to ancient art, that's, I think, much more the general sense. But he also had great admiration for Renaissance art and for Raphael in particular. So Twombly does his version of the Parnassus, and you know, he's using his patented style where he's pushing toward, you know, total non-objectivity with gestural strokes, with mark making. But if you look closely at some of those strokes and mark making, take it right here. He says Parnasso right there, and he cancels it a bit. So he is playing a visual game. It's like, really look at this. And he gives it the Italian name, and he puts, let me find it for you right there. You see the 1964? And that indeed is the date. So he's saying, don't just walk away and say, this is not objective. This is my emotive, my patented style, my gestural strokes and my emotional marks, but I'm giving you my version in response to Raphael's Parnassus. And you see, again, looking closely, you know, marks for the trees that are there and the movement of color and some sense of the light there. But he wants it. He wants his image to teeter on the edge of gestural, pure formality and the content, which he then often will help us out by writing it somewhere on the surface. Let's go backwards again and say, did you know that Raphael also had some abstract passages? Right here, I'm getting you really, really close-up views of some other passages from the stanze, which were made available because of you know, wonderful restorations with attendant photos that were fairly recently published. But look at Raphael just making those marks because he knows, he's counting on the fact that your eye is going to mix all those up as you stand back and look at these giant frescoes from the Poplar Point. Oh, I've gotten off my X too. And when you get up close, you know, I was going to even cheat some more. And in that sort of the soldier's mail, I was going to just take a piece where you don't see the shoulder or the neckline. You see total abstract marks. Look at the rings where he is showing you those stones, the gems, and the light that they reflect with those incredibly broad strokes and so forth. So as I keep saying, look back and forth at the strategies that these artists have had, and you're going to find some commonalities. Leon Golub, another artist who was very beholden to an entire history of art, really, but particularly ancient and also Renaissance Roman in particular, because one of the reasons that Leon Golub, who you might know, was a New York artist, and he was always committed to figural painting. He was raised and had his art training at the Art Institute in Chicago, but then his career in New York. But he talked about how hostile the art world was in the 1950s to any artist working in a figural style, to the point where he and Nancy Sparrow, remember her fantastic subway mosaics, she and he, husband and wife, they left to live in Europe for a great part of the 50s so that they could continue to do their work as artists in the figural tradition and have some potential for, you know, support and interest in a community where they could talk about it. Now, when I show you this painting of Time's Up, and I'm just looking at my watch as I say that, again, you might say, okay, well, there's a skull in there. oh, yeah, there's a Sacred Heart in there. Okay, some references, but they're pretty generalized. Well, look again, because that detail that I show you right there, okay, if you can read the tiny little et in Arcadia ego, and that is Guercino's painting, where the Teschia, where the skull is. And Leon turned that upside down. There again is the passage where he tells you that's what he was looking at and thinking about. And that's the whole point of the meditation. Think about this beautiful place where death also lurks. And where could that beautiful place be? Where, well, again, we see the bird now as a predator, the bald eagle, a symbol of America as a predator. So a statement to his own culture. Let's watch, the violence. What are we doing here? He wanted to use figural work to engage questions about contemporary society, human rights, violence, and he does it with the help of his artistic predecessors. And this was shown very recently. You see that that's an unstretched canvas. It's really large, and I should have given you an installation shot because it was just up in an exhibition in Hauser and Wirth in New York that Rashid Johnson curated. And he is another very exciting contemporary artist. And it was bit around this image of Golub's, and he put an amazing exhibition together. So with that in mind, I just show you the rest of the references. That Sacred Heart. By chance, I thought that one painting by Battoni was a great one because it's showing you this is what we're talking about. If you don't have that reference, Golub put barbed wire around it. I mentioned the bird as predator, and of course, Rubens' Prometheus bound is a great one to think about for that tradition. And yet, with all of this heaviness and violent thought, Golub still has a moment of a light touch where he drops a little card down. It's almost like one of those quiz shows or cartoons or something, Time's Up, and that's the name of the painting. So as my time moves on, I've got to move myself because I couldn't not mention these wonderful works by Alison Malinsky, The Three Graces and Dance in the Favorable Zephyrus Wind, where she is riffing on, of course, the Italian tradition of Botticelli's Primavera. And what you might not know is that, again, you see she is doing these abstract works, but the colors and the shapes, the movement of the blues are telling you that these abstractions have their basis in nature. And in her series called Primavera, which was then an exhibition here because this artist was an artist in residence in this research institute of the NIKI. And there you see their pamphlet to invite everyone to come and have a look. There, of course, is the point of reference in art. She also had a poem, and she also wanted nature to be her points of reference. Alison Malinsky, by the way, is an American artist living in Barcelona. And she came here to have, was it some months in residence? And the result was then this exhibition, which I'm so sorry not to have been here to see. But the bottom image shows you one of her paintings with a view out to the NIKI Gardens. And I know that she included that as part of her exhibition. She made some plantings and had the garden in real life become part of this ode to Primavera in this wonderful contemporary abstract palette. So having said that, what I want to end up with is a little bit of homage to Leonardo. So now what I'm going to do is see what happens if, as a theme, I take this figure of the Renaissance that for our culture, I would say is still the point of reference for popular culture, for modern culture. When you talk about the Renaissance, Leonardo has enormous interest for us. And for the NIKI in particular, it has a great deal of interest because this research institute has always forwarded the interest in Leonardo and have had courses quite regularly from very new points of view, exhibitions that deal with his work, and in the person of the director, innovative scholarship on a regular basis about Leonardo. So I couldn't not, in the place of Leonardo's coming to age as a painter, since we are here in Florence, all of these things say that I will end with a homage to Leonardo. And there's a little bit of fantasy in here, starting with Faith Ringgold's fantastic fantasy, where she tells you a story, and you can see that story is in the borders where she writes it out, right up there in that white border. She talks about a young African-American artist who comes to visit a friend in Paris, and that's when that young woman decides to be an artist. But one of the things they do is they all go to the Louvre, and the story tells us that when they arrived, the daughters of her friend broke into a dance. And I just thought, if I could ever get to see the Mona Lisa in an empty room, I would break into a dance as well. So that is the beginning of the fantasy for all of us, not to mention all of the other Italian paintings that we don't get to see because of that. So we're all going to dance in front of this wonderful empty room in the Louvre, along with Faith Ringgold from her French collection of story quilts. And then from hers, tell you a not usual suspect when we think about artists who had great admiration and studied the Renaissance, and that is Odilon Redon, who, with two M's then, made an homage at Léonard de Vinci. You can see that he made a very, very touching study of the head of Mary that's there in the center, that is by Redon, and then his little fantasy, which he called the homage to Leonardo, where there is a female head that echoes his studies that were made so precisely. But, you know, in many ways, it makes sense that Redon would love the mysteriousness of Leonardo, the sfumato, in terms of the qualities that he wanted in his own art. So there's an unusual suspect. And back to Crissot, who makes a Gorgon by painting the face of that lovely Ginevra de' Benci onto what is a sea fan species, Gorgonia ventalina. And again, when Crissot tells me that's a Gorgon, my first thing was, why are you making Ginevra, that lovely young woman with the curls? It's not snakes in her hair, but he put it on this form from nature that has that name. So again, he's playing games with art and nature and wanting us to put them together as we look at his work. He painted that sea fan with acrylic paint to make that object. And here, of course, we have to have a look at The Last Supper. Mary Beth Edelson was an artist, an early feminist artist, who's not talked about so much now, which is a shame, but she used the, as we would say today, iconic image of The Last Supper as a table of active women artists, and their name is under each of them, just the way we find in many of the Renaissance frescoes where the saints are named, so we know the cast. And not only does she have all of these women at the table, but she decides to put 50 other women artists around the border just to make her point. Andy Warhol uses that painting in a way which, in my opinion, shows that he was always just such a good designer. For me, that's Warhol's strength. And he took different elements and made this lovely design within a very large group of works based on The Last Supper that were first exhibited across the street from Santa Maria delle Grazie. So that's something that would have been amazing to behold. Okay, well, we have to say something about Leonardo's Vitruvian Man, and I love the fact that Harmonia Rosales, whom we talked a great deal about last time, has done her version of The Virtuous Woman in that same format, which by now, again, is an image that almost stands for the Renaissance and the idealization of the human figure, and from Vitruvius's text. Now, what I like in addition to all of the amazing content, is that the way I've put these slides together, images together, I keep calling them slides, but they're not, they look the same scale. In fact, the Rosales Virtuous Woman is painted on linen. It's oil on linen. It's about 6 feet tall, whereas the Leonardo sheet is about, 12 inches. So she out-monumentalized her predecessor with her, as she changed that figure in both race and gender. And from that very monumental statement, I thought you might enjoy looking at advertising. That also takes up Leonardo. There, the illustrator Cole Phillips decided to make the Vitruvian Man into a woman for a hosiery ad. And I came across that in this fantastic collection of images that the New York Public has, where they just have folder after folder after folder of like sheets from magazines, all categorized. So I looked at advertising in the 1920s and 30s and came across a few of those. So there is another reaction to Leonardo from the 1920s. And then a moment of poetry, his soaring spirit takes wing. I thought, whenever we have a contemporary artist who uses a lot of bird imagery and wings and so forth, we can't not think of Leonardo, because again, it's just so saturates our cultural references. So a few of his bird studies, and then of course he wants human beings to fly as well. So when I saw Keiko Ueda's series of birds in the Olympia Gallery recently, she is Japanese born, has been living and working in New York for since her adolescence. And she, as you see on the left, makes bird forms from cutting paper and then layering these sheets so that she's making a kind of relief sculpture. She says she's drawing by cutting, and she comes up with fantastic hybrid creatures, which I think Leonardo would have appreciated. And when I saw these, I thought, okay, birds and wings, but probably she doesn't have to be thinking of him. And then as I look more closely, look what we have. Can I get this right? Liona. Leonardo is in there, and so is Uccello, and so is Oiseau, and so is Harbinger. So in all of her patterning, she's got messages, and the title, Tori, 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 that is the word for bird in Japanese. So I think Leonardo would have loved those approaches. But from that, let's get to something else about wings, that they can be dangerous. So Leonardo tried to get wings for human beings that would take them airborne. And Dred Scott, whom we've met before, remember he had Pirate Jenny with that gold leaf. He used this gold leaf again for a winged figure whose face is disintegrating. And I would say, Icarus flew too close to the sun and the wings melted. And, I started thinking, well, but, wings could be angels, could be demons. And in fact, and as you continue to consider that painting and look at the bottom, there's something very disturbing, because there is a layer of tar across the bottom of that painting. And that gives you a much more violent and horrendous reference, which of course is that vigilante punishment of tar and feathering, where you would strip down a human being, cover them in tar and feathers. That actually started in the 12th century. Someone documented that. I had no idea, but it more recent history was used by the colonists, who eventually became Americans, against British tax collectors and British loyalists. And then in more recent history, of course, the Ku Klux Klan against the African American community in the past. So this now is Dred Scott, I think, bringing us down the bottom there to say, think about this as well. And that title is one more of his homages to Nina Simone. I Wish I Knew How It Felt to Be Free, one of her great songs. And so again, you have all of that flying freedom that Leonardo was interested in. Then really horrible aspects of humanity's violence against each other, all in that one image. Ravens, vultures are birds that have a more scary element to them, and an artist named Ebony Patterson made installations in the New York Botanical Garden, where she was an artist in residence, that dealt with this. And I'll show you one of the things that you would come upon that was quite startling, when you would see the bird and then, oh, the water's red. And then you look back and see these legs and feet that she made of cast glass that come out of there. So Ebony Patterson, working with this kind of imagery, and as an artist in residence there, working between Kingston, Jamaica, and I believe Chicago. Okay, now Tommy Harrison, just one more meditation on birds and flight and swans, but he fell on a swan, it seems. That makes me think of later, because he told us Twins is the title, and it's a self-portrait. He, by the way, is UK artist living in Manchester. So we have a scholar here from Manchester. You might ask him what this is all about, because he's fallen on that swan. There's a dove beside him. The twins make a reference to the Leda and the swan mythology, because two sets of twins were born from Leda's having to do with Jupiter. It's sometimes shown as cuddling, like Leonardo did, sometimes as a more violent act. But in some way, Tommy Harrison is taking that up to show you a self-portrait, something very personal about himself. And here's where I'm going to drop you off, in Amsterdam, where Bastardia was given a commission by the Amsterdam, let me get this name right, the Street Art Museum in Amsterdam. And they commissioned her to do this mural, where she started with flower imagery, but in conversation with the community, they wanted many more birds in it, because it is a community where many migrants come. So they like the idea of the migration of birds as a symbol. And also, as the site of the Street Art Museum tells us, that blue kingfishers from mythology, which are also known as halcyon birds, and cormorants are commonly found along the Netherlands coast and waterways. So the cormorant and the halcyon bird that she put in there have particular meaning for the community, along with this idea of everyone coming together in a new place, and that the Dutch are and should be proud of the country's strong maritime traditions. And Bastardia made these images to have a resonance for the community. So having dropped us down in Amsterdam, I want to thank NIKI again for giving me the chance to share all of this with you, for this wonderful group of young colleagues with whom I've had the pleasure of talking, for the staff that made all of this happen, and especially Lee Queel, who made all this run smoothly, and the director, of course, who is both genial and geniale, works in both languages. Thank you so much.